Hi, I'm Hazel. It's once again Saturday, which makes it time to sit down and catch up on the WoW news of the week, what I've been up to, and answer some of your questions. This week, yesterday to be specific, Preach got to sit down and talk to Ian on his stream about Shadowlands and Covenants, and mostly Covenants. A couple of big takeaways from this latest, I would say, interview. I don't think interview is exactly how it was framed. It was supposed to be more of a discussion, but we did learn a couple of new things here. The big headline, at least for me, is that Destructible Conduits are not the final design and will not go in. What Ian said is they typically don't like to announce that they're not going to do a thing until they have another solution to present instead, and right now they don't have that second solution just yet. They're working on that, but they want people to know that the current design of Conduits, which, if you're out of the loop, in Shadowlands, you get a soulbind, a couple of soulbind like talent trees, and they have basically gem slots where you put special gems in that give you class abilities. I'm using the gem analogy because up until this point you would replace one if you put a different one or another one in that socket, and Ian has said that that destructible version of it is not what's going into the game. So what they're trying to do there is sort of strike a balance between having like a permanent choice that you cannot adjust at all, but it's also not something that they want you messing with and speccing out fully regularly like you do your talents. So they're going to try to find a solution that gives you a middle ground to that, but doesn't require you to just grind out a ton of extra conduits if you want the option of swapping them out. He talked a little bit about how in BFA they tried to discourage people from respecking their Azurite gear by having the rising gold cost where it's cheap at first and gets more and more expensive, and how they discovered that for some people there is no discouraging. As long as it's doable, they're going to do it, and then whatever the most expensive price is becomes the normal price and it becomes awful, so they're not going to do that again. If I had to guess on what they're going to do for conduits instead, I would say some kind of library system like essences where you collect them and then add them to a library, but maybe with some kind of a cooldown on slotting them so that you don't necessarily switch them out all the time, because there's already going to be a number of things that you'll customize on a day-to-day basis depending on what you're up to, and I'm sure they're not trying to add more onto that. So that would be my guess. Library, but with cooldowns, you know, like a time-based penalty as opposed to like a currency-based penalty, but we'll see. We also learned that new waves of beta invites are going to be more or less a weekly thing going forward from now until the end of the beta, so if you did not get in the first wave and you're antsy to get in and start testing Shadowlands, don't give up hope, because there's going to be a lot more invites on a weekly basis. So the rest of the discussion was Preach and Ian talking about various reasons and philosophies to justify more or less friction in covenant swapping. So again, for background, in Shadowlands you're going to be able to choose a covenant. There's 4, they're very highly themed, and each covenant has a utility ability as well as one class specific ability. So as a priest, I'm going to get a different button depending on whether I go Kyrian, Venthyr, Necrolord, or Nightfang. And you know, whenever you have a choice like that that is semi-permanent, you know, covenants are intended to be something that you more or less pick and then you use. The balancing of those things becomes a very contentious issue. So Preach was kind of arguing in favor of why not allow us to switch more frictionlessly so that we can take the best ability for any given situation, because it feels bad to be locked into one thing or another based on maybe I chose it because it was good for one thing and now I want to do another thing, or maybe my best in slot covenant is not my favorite cosmetically, arguing that locking players into certain combat abilities based on their covenant choice feels bad in a lot of contexts, and it's going to be a nightmare for them to balance. And then Ian is sort of giving more justification for why they have friction and why they believe that choice should be limiting to some extent. And there was a lot of detail and nuance in the conversation, but what it basically boils down to is how locked in to a certain combat ability, like a covenant ability such as your class ability or maybe your soulbinds, should you be by a choice such as covenant, which is semi-permanent and also heavily cosmetically based as well. Like maybe you have a favorite covenant thematically, but then the abilities are not the best for you and what you like to do, and how do we resolve that tension? I don't think that the argument anymore is necessarily let us swap covenants versus never have us swap covenants, because they've already caved a bit and said you're going to be able to change covenants. The problem is just changing back to your original one if you change your mind and want to come back. They don't mind you making a different decision later on, but they want it to be something that you just don't do on the fly based on whether you're going to go do world questing or dungeons or raiding. They want it to be something a little more permanent that you don't treat with the same flexibility as your spec. So one point that Ian made in support of this that kind of resonated with me is that right now you already have, when preparing for a piece of content, you're looking at your spec and your talents and your gear and your trinket as well as your chosen consumables, and you're also going to have the choice to select your soulbind loadout and conduits to some extent. And adding in Covenant choice to that, which brings in its own decisions of soulbinds, is kind of an extra layer of decisions and busy work that is not needed. We can already do so much to customize our character to be flexible for different types of content that it just becomes kind of overwhelming if you are then considering a Covenant choice in addition to those things. The other way that Ian phrased it that made sense to me is that some things in WoW are permanent choices that will really inform your character's identity. They really play into who you are deciding to be in World of Warcraft, a major example being your class. And then some other choices are more flexible and more about customizing what tools do you want to have with you that are less about identity and more about what you're going to be able to do, such as your talents. Both of the things in that example, your class and your talents, have major combat ramifications. It's not as though your class is cosmetic only and then everything that impacts your combat potential is changeable. That's already not the case. So what they want in Shadowlands is to have systems that are flexible and systems that feel more permanent and like meaningful, impactful choices, which does kind of mean consequences. It does mean that you're not always going to have the best button for every situation. He said that covenants have been designed from the beginning to kind of fall into that first category, where it's something that you make your decision from and it's going to boost you in some areas and not boost you as much in others. It's going to specialize you a little bit. And that's a concept that we do already have in classes. Like, I played a Shadow Priest for a couple of expansions now, and in any given raid tier, there's usually like 1 to 3 fights where we're really good, and then 1 to 3 fights where we're quite bad, and then, you know, like the rest of the fights are all kind of middle of the pack. And that's one of the things that lends flavor to the whole experience. I think it would be kind of exhausting and take something away from my feeling of identity in the game if I was to switch, for example, to the flavor of the month class on a fight-by-fight basis within a raid, or, you know, I'm going to only do my world quests on demon hunters and I'm going to only do raiding on mages, for example. I feel like taking the downs as well as the ups is part of what kind of endears me to a chosen experience. However, I fully accept that my perspective is just my perspective and it's not the only one, and it's not necessarily the right one. I think that there's a lot of ways to look at design issues like this, and depending on who you are and how you play the game and what you value in the game, you're going to have very different opinions, and, you know, that doesn't make two opposing opinions right or wrong. It's just their perspective on the game, because it's a big game with like a lot of people in it. So for me, as a non-mythic raider, what this is really going to come down to, like where I'll eventually land on this issue, is can they balance them well enough that there is no right or wrong choice. Like, if I decide that I really want to be a Venthyr or my Shadow Priest, and it turns out that that is just the worst option for AoE and for dungeons and for questing, it's just not as much damage and there's no two ways about it, that sucks, and I don't think that's what anybody wants. They've said they're trying to avoid that, and so it's a question of whether we think they can avoid that. In a perfect world, every Covenant/class combo has upsides and downsides that balance out with other ones. The problem that I have with very low friction Covenant swapping, if they did eventually go that way, is that it then becomes expected for everybody. It becomes expected that you're going to show up to Mythic Night in your best Mythic Covenant and Raid Night in your best Raid Covenant and so on. And I would like to be able to enjoy the highs of my Covenant at the expense of the lows without people going, what are you doing? That's wrong, right? Like, if that becomes the experience for everybody, then I'm allowed to do it, kind of. And I understand that that mindset is kind of taking away choice for the top 1% of players that really want it to do their very, very, very best, you know, for my own selfish reasons. I'm not saying it's the right way to feel, that's just how I feel. In the sphere of the game that I live in, being in the worst possible Covenant is probably not going to prevent me from achieving any goals that I have. I could probably take the worst possible Covenant, whatever that turns out to be, and still progress in my heroic raid, and still do the quests, and still collect transmog, and still PvP, and get vicious mounts. Like, I feel like the things that I'm doing, at least, are not so tightly tuned and difficult for me that I'm gonna really need that extra couple percent of efficiency for every given situation. So I think that's probably why I'm not as mad about it. I see this as more of a perception issue where, like, the internet declares this Covenant class combination awful, and then you feel bad because that's the one that you kind of like, even if it's not perfect, or maybe you can't get into groups. Maybe you're getting declined from pugs because you are not the optimal combo. That is a valid concern, and it is a real problem that I think is kind of unfortunately going to happen either way. I think pugs will always try to take the most efficient player for their content, and the only way you can make sure that is every player is to homogenize the game and like the classes and the covenants so much that your choices don't mean anything anymore and everybody has access to everything, and that's not the world that I want to live in either. To wrap this up and stop rambling so much, I think this is an issue that they will never make everybody happy on, because it's such a divisive thing that has valid points on both sides of it. I am personally optimistic that I'll like it well enough, and even if I don't like it, I have a feeling it's not going to be expansion ruining for me. I really did not care for Azerite armor and still don't in BFA, and that was pretty central early on, and I just kind of, you know, put on what I got and then did a little suboptimally and didn't worry about it anymore, and then went on to have plenty of fun anyways. BFA is one of my favorite expansions, so it's probably not going to ruin my life, but I do understand where the frustration is coming from. Other news this week, in the Shadowlands Alpha, there is a newcomer mentor system. So there is an NPC in Orgrimmar and Stormwind that allows you to opt in to becoming a new player mentor. You can do this as long as you are level 60, which is going to be level cap in Shadowlands, of course, as well as having completed some basic achievements and have your account in good standing, so no penalties on your account. This will give you access to a newcomer chat channel, as well as give you a little marker by your name in the world so that people can identify you and ask you stuff. I love the intent behind this. I think that anything we can do to kind of ease new players into the game is always going to be for the best, but I think as far as this actual system, there will be mixed results from like what kind of help people are actually going to get from it. I think there are going to be some very experienced players that are in there and happy to help and guide new players. I think you're also going to have some underinformed players that are just as enthusiastic to help that might be unintentionally giving out bad info. And you might also get some people in that system that are just there to like troll and take advantage of new players, so I am expecting a mixed bag. We already have a system for dungeons, at least, where you can opt in to being a dungeon guide. That's supposed to indicate that you are happy to explain mechanics and kind of guide your group through the dungeon if anybody has questions. And I have not once seen that used. Well, I've seen helpful people in dungeons. I just think that that particular role doesn't carry a lot of meaning in WoW, and I am a little afraid that this newcomer mentorship thing is going to have the same fate. Also this week, we got a blue post sharing that in Shadowlands, Gladiator Mounts, future and old ones, are going to become account-wide. So the current version of the game we have is that if you earn a Gladiator mount, you have that forever, but just on that character that earned it. And this means that you'll be able to use any Glad mounts that you may have earned in the past or may earn in the future on any of your characters. The problem that I'm seeing a lot of people have with this change is that Gladiator mounts kind of used to, or to some extent still do, denote a certain level of expertise in a given player. Like if you see somebody on a Gladiator mount, you know that they earned that on that character. They are an expert at that class, and having the mount become account wide will kind of dull that somewhat. It'll still show you what season they earned it in, because the mounts change every season, but just because you see a monk on the Glad mount doesn't mean they know anything about playing monk. However, I would argue that Gladiator carries have been a thing for a long time. The prevalence of people paying gold or other stuff for Gladiator has kind of sapped away from some of that prestige. Like if you see somebody on the mount, you are not immediately sure of whether they've earned it or whether they've bought it. And then also Gladiator in more recent expansions has become varying levels of easy to get, especially ever since they changed to it being just a flat rating thing as opposed to like a top X% thing. So I am selfishly of the opinion that it's not so prestigious that they needed to keep it character specific anymore. I'm excited about it being account wide. I don't have any Glad mounts. I've always wanted one. I've never earned one. I'm not good enough for it. But like if I ever did earn a Glad mount, it would probably be on my druid, and then I would never see it again because it's a druid. You stealth into the arena and then you fly around as a bird. You never see the mount. So this kind of provides some extra motivation for me to want to put in the time and effort to do that in Shadowlands, because I'll actually be able to use the mount on other characters and kind of show off a little bit, even if it's not the same character. However, I do totally understand people that are frustrated with this and think it's going to kind of dim the prestige of what has been longest one of the most prestigious things that you can have in the game. And a alternate kind of mid-ground solution has been tossed around to make the mounts class-wide instead of being account-wide, so that you can tell that they are a good rogue or a good mage, but not necessarily on that one. That doesn't solve my druid problem, but I do see where they're coming from. It's also important to note that rank 1 titles are still character specific, and it looks like they're going to remain that way. Questions for this week, and actually all 3 of these were asked by more than one person each, so a couple of frequently asked questions here. The first one was, how will you be notified if you are selected for beta, from Joe? So you will be notified by email. They will send you an email, but usually before the email has a chance to get to you, it will show up in your launcher. So if you look at your launcher, there is a drop-down menu above the play button with your versions, like where you would go to select classic or regular. And if you are selected for the beta, you will see Shadowlands beta as an option in that drop-down list. So if you are anxiously refreshing to see if you got beta, that's the place that you want to keep checking. Jean wants to know if the beta progress is erased when Shadowlands goes live. Yes, it is. Beta is not like early access. I mean, it kind of is, but you do not get to keep any of the progress. You do not get to keep your characters. If you have like a mount drop for you in beta, you do not get that in real life, like in the real game. It is all wiped at the end of beta, and sometimes it's wiped in the middle of beta. They do character wipes and resets sometimes, so you cannot count on keeping your progress in any way, shape, or form. It's just for testing out the content and getting a feel for what it's like, and then submitting feedback to Blizzard. And then Skunk wants to know, how do you hang out with a fish? So I'm not like in the tank. I would say by observing the fish and by spending time near them, which is also helpful for the health of your fish. It's useful to kind of get a feel for what their normal behavior patterns are like, what they act like when they are feeling well versus feeling poorly, what's going on in their tank, how their plants are doing. That's all kind of useful information to have as a fish keeper, and the best way to get that is to spend some time by the tank every day to kind of like observe it and check in with what's going on. I would also say that with betta fish particularly, they definitely know when you are there in front of the tank and they will interact with you. And regardless of how they specifically feel about you, it's good stimulation for them. It's nice to have some variety in their day as long as you're not like tapping on the glass or anything like that. So I will sit in front of the tank. Like if I'm going to be meditating for a bit, I'll just like set up right in front of the tank so that he can see me while I'm doing that. If I'm going to be planning a bunch of stuff in my journal, I'll just kind of like set up there. Especially with this setup, I have a little bit of table space in front of the tank. I'll use that to set up his food and whatnot before I feed him, but I can also put a little book or an iPad there if I want to set up and draw or something like that. And that has been my week. Thank you very much for watching. If you have a question that you would like me to answer on one of these news videos, please leave it as a comment on the most recent one. Stop by a stream sometime if you like, and have a wonderful, wonderful day.